7 months ago, on October 7th, Hamas was able to carry out its shocking terror attack against Israel. Despite Israel's intelligence, military, and security apparatus, commonly considered to be the best in the world. Bearing in mind Israel's incredibly sophisticated and capable defenses and brigades of trained IDF soldiers stationed near the Gaza border, Hamas representative Ali Baraka explained to the Washington Post the ease with which Israel's entire security apparatus disintegrated, saying, "But the Israeli army collapsed in front of us. What were we to do?" Well, in response to the Al-Aqsa flood attack, the Israeli military's retaliatory efforts, codenamed Operation Swords of Iron, has resulted in the deaths of over 100 journalists, 190 United Nations staff, 34,000 Palestinians, including 13,000 children, displaced nearly the entire Gaza population of 2 million people, and cost the United States almost $50 billion. So how did October 7th happen? Well, almost everyone in mainstream media was quick to call it an intelligence failure. The Guardian told its readers on the afternoon of October 7th that Hamas's murderous attack will be remembered as an Israeli intelligence failure for the ages. While the attack was still ongoing, on October 7th, Politico quoted Israel's former deputy national security advisor saying, quote, "It's a failure in terms of intelligence, operationally. It's clear that we were caught totally unprepared by this." And on October 8th, Jonathan Panikoff, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer on the Middle East, who's now at the Atlantic Council think tank, firmly educated the public that, quote, "This was an intelligence failure. It could not be otherwise." In fact, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quickly tweeted, then deleted a statement saying that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of this coming attack, saying, quote, "Under no circumstances and at no stage was Prime Minister Netanyahu warned of war intentions on the part of Hamas." The tweet said that before it was promptly deleted. Why did Netanyahu's team delete that tweet? Did he, in fact, have intelligence that there would be an attack by Hamas? Well, the evidence seems to point to only one answer. Yes. Foreign security services, Israeli security services, and the Israeli public all knew that Hamas was planning a violent cross-border incursion where they would attempt to overrun and attack the kibbutz communities in southern Israel, and then take prisoners back to Gaza. And they also knew when. But it happened anyway. 10 days before the attack, and then again 3 days before the attack, Egypt's intelligence officials actually sent repeated warnings to the highest levels of the Israeli government. In one of those warnings, Egypt's premier intelligence minister, General Abbas Kamel, personally called Netanyahu and warned him that Hamas was about to do, quote, "something unusual, a terrible operation." Unnamed Egyptian officials told Ynet News that they were shocked by Netanyahu's indifference to the news. But Israel didn't have to trust or believe Egypt, because actually, most of the warnings of the October 7th attack came from Israeli civilians and the Israeli military itself. The civilians and soldiers who brought these emergency warnings to the military were ignored, and in some cases, strangely enough, threatened with legal action.
So let me bring in Ben Swann. He's a two-time Emmy-winning journalist who has worked for various TV stations, including KDBC El Paso, KFOX in El Paso, KTSM in El Paso, WIX in Newport, Kentucky, Cincinnati, and RT America. He's also a political commentator and founder of the Truth in Media Project, a web series that focuses on investigative reporting and alternative news. Please welcome to the show, Ben Swann. Hey, Ben, how are you?
Jimmy, I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
So were you shocked as I was to learn that, wow, the Israeli army just kind of crumbled right in front of a bunch of guys in hang gliders and Adidas sweats? And
yeah, I think it was shocking. Yeah.
And that also Benjamin Netanyahu, they did have advance warning of what was happening. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, it's not just weird, right? When you start to see the weird part, right, which you alluded to, when you hear about this story back in October and November, it's like, how did guys come across in paragliders? Like, is this real? This really happened? They flew across the border in these very like primitive makeshift setups. They were able to come across and yeah, exactly. It was like completely wild in the way they're coming in, and they overwhelmed Israeli defense forces. Again, as we pointed out, the best in the world. How do you manage to pull this off? And then when you start to look into the story,
I guess I should just expect it now that this has to be reported by people like you And places like this are the gray zone. It's never going to be reported on ABC or MSNBC or even Fox or CNN. They just go along with this was, again, what you just showed. Oh, no, it was an intelligence fail. We didn't know. Oh, we got caught with our pants down. Chagrin.
So let's go all the way back to 2022 and then work our way forward to the days before the October 7th attacks. In 2022, the IDF, through confidential sources or spies in Gaza, actually obtained the detailed Hamas Al-Aqsa flood attack plans. Codenamed Jericho Wall by Israel, that incursion plan called for a barrage of rockets to begin the attack, and then for gunmen to pour into Israel en masse via paragliders, on motorcycles, and on foot, and then take hostages back into Gaza. All of it, every bit of that happened on October 7th. Hamas followed its own blueprints that Israel already had in its possession with shocking precision. So Israel literally had the attack blueprints. But were they taken seriously by the IDF? Again, yes. The plans were diligently studied. In fact, a presentation on the planned attack was given to senior officers in the IDF's Gaza division. The presentation concluded with this sentence, quote, "This invasion constitutes the gravest threat that IDF forces are facing in the defense of Israel." So in response to all of this, did Israel's intelligence apparatus actually enhance or beef up their surveillance of the Hamas militants along the Gaza border? Well, actually, not only is the answer no, but stunningly, they did the exact opposite. They decided to entirely stop monitoring Hamas's handheld radio traffic because they saw it as a waste of effort. Even though during that same time, in 2022, Israelis living in the kibbutz communities near the Gaza border, most of whom have some type of military training because of Israel's mandatory IDF service laws, they were, according to Israeli media, picking up clear evidence that Hamas was practicing the breaching of the fence and conquering kibbutzim and seizing hostages and destroying everything in their path. Then in April of 2023, again, this is still 6 months before the attack, the IDF, according to Israeli media, actually did something even more surprising. They restricted the ability of Israeli citizens living along the border to monitor Hamas's wireless traffic. In September of 2023, that's less than a month before the attack, the head of the IDF's Devil's Advocate intelligence unit, which challenges prevailing narratives within Israel's military, twice alerted senior decision makers in both the army and the political spheres about Hamas's plans for a large-scale cross-border military operation. He reiterated those warnings in person at intelligence branch strategic assessment sessions on September 26th and September 27th. This is just days before the attack. During this period, again, just days before the Al-Aqsa flood attack, Israeli civilians residing in the kibbutzim near the Gaza border were witnessing with their own eyes and ears constant and enormous Hamas training exercises. The army reportedly turned a blind eye. One of these Israelis, Ben Shoshan, worked as a tour guide in the southeastern Israeli region surrounding Gaza. In a radio interview just days before October 7th, she remarked, quote, "Hamas has been training for weeks right up against the border, sometimes in massive numbers. I tried to warn the officers, but they told me I didn't know anything and that I was safe." On October 3rd, a journalist for Israeli Public Radio tweeted and made crystal clear that the bizarre and violent Hamas drills that were taking place on the Gaza side of the border were evident to everyone who was living alongside that border, including the Israeli military. The Islamic Jihad organization started noisy exercises very close to the border, with missile launches, simulating breaking into Israel and kidnapping soldiers. Didi Fold, a resident of Netiv Hatara, said, "It was significantly closer than previous times. The children wake up and they ask what's going on. There are explosions, booms. It is not similar to previous exercises." So it was clear to everyone that Hamas wasn't only planning to do something horrible, but it was also clear exactly what that horrible and evil thing was. According to a female IDF soldier who spoke to Israel's Channel 12 news program, she was constantly trying to warn her superiors about the gravity of the Hamas training exercises. And she was threatened with legal action, saying, quote, "We were told that if we continue to harass on this issue, you will stand trial." So, Egypt knew, the Israeli military knew, and the Israeli civilians knew. And yet 2 days before October 7th, the Israeli military took 2 entire commando brigades, that's around 100 soldiers, away from the soon-to-be breached locations of the Gaza border and sent them to the other side of the country. And despite there being giant Israeli dance parties taking place right along the same border fence where violent, escalating, and obvious Hamas drills of breaching and kidnapping were taking place. Does this make any sense? And have you heard about these dance parties? Because it turns out there's bizarre and inexplicable narratives surrounding the planning of these now infamous dance parties in Israel along the Gaza border. Yeah, well, it's a couple things. And by the way, 9/11 was always referred to as an intelligence failure also, right? Oh, it was an intelligence failure. Our agencies, we need more agencies to work together and have more power in order to not have intelligence failures, right? So that's the game they play. And the fact is, not only could they have predicted it, they absolutely knew it was happening. They watched it happening, it looks like in real time, and they stepped away and said, let it happen. They allowed this to happen.
It looked like exactly what this is, was that Israel stood down on purpose. They turned the other way. They let this happen. They did everything they could to make sure this happened so that they could use this attack on October 7th as the reason to go in and carpet bomb Gaza and slaughter these people and eventually take over Gaza. What it's looked like to us here, but your great reporting and the way you put this together spells it out perfectly. I mean, it just, none of that makes sense whatsoever unless what we surmise is happening, our theory, is true. Otherwise, that doesn't make any sense that they could be that incompetent, that they would approve that party even after the local IDF person, even after their own citizens are telling them what's happening. So the only thing that makes sense is that Israel not only allowed this to happen, but did things that encouraged this to happen.
It's pretty serious when a government allows something like this to happen. But even more than allowing it to happen, it appears that they did two other things. And one was that they prevented their own people who were living in these communities from knowing what was coming and lied to them repeatedly when it was questioned and people were saying, look, what's going on over here? Obviously, there's something different happening here. Can't you guys see what they're doing? No, you're safe. You're safe. You're safe. And then the fact that they would allow for this party on the 7th, which had not been previously scheduled, to allow that to happen also means that you're not just allowing it, you're creating the conditions for maximum carnage. Israel could have knocked it down with no problem. They knew what was happening, when it was happening. They could have shot these guys out of their paragliders with no problem. But they chose to allow it to happen and created the conditions for maximum carnage. Then the Nova Festival, the October 7th party, was actually added last minute, only a few days in advance of the event. So for obvious reasons, any significantly large gatherings on the Israeli side of the border with Gaza require Israeli military approval. Again, this is a part of the story that virtually no American media network will talk about. According to Israeli media reports, Lieutenant Colonel Sahir Fogel, an operations officer at the IDF's Gaza division, opposed the approval of the Nova Party based on a couple of things: the last-minute nature of its event application, the intensifying Hamas drills at the border, and because if something were to happen, more soldiers were on holiday. It was the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. The lieutenant colonel explained his opposition to the party's approval to his superiors, and he was instructed to allow the event to happen. Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that other Gaza division officers privately told of irregular conduct and pressure surrounding the approval of that party. In February of 2024, Elkanah Fetterman, the head of security of the Nova Festival, gave an interview to Israel's Channel 14 where he made a statement that has not been reported on by any American media. He said this, quote, "I had a guard at the festival who had served in the Re'im division near the Gaza border. And a week before the festival, he sent me a voice message, basically warning me, saying, quote, Elkanah, something is going to happen over Sukkot. I just wanted to let you know there were a lot of warnings. I passed the voice message on to the local IDF officials, and they told me everything was all right." After the attack, Fetterman called his friend in the IDF and asked him exactly what he knew, saying, quote, "You were speaking in codes. Tell me exactly what they showed you." He told me, "Elkanah, they told me there was going to be an invasion and that they were planning to take over settlements. I just wasn't allowed to tell you that." And that's what happened. If he knew what he knew, a driver on the Gaza border, what did those above him know? Because he is a small screw in the system, end quote. The Hamas attacks were violent and brutal, and they've been likened to tragic events such as the September 11th attacks or even the Holocaust. which makes it strange that Benjamin Netanyahu and members of his party have at times described these attacks as somewhat of a political gift. Well, back in January, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that Israel did not have the domestic or international support to invade or destroy Gaza. He said the October 7th Hamas attack solved both of those problems for him. Listen to this.
We couldn't get the domestic consensus to make such a definitive solution to the problem of Hamas. That is, no one would agree across the Israeli public to go in and basically destroy Hamas, go throughout Gaza and destroy Hamas. We didn't have the international consensus either. Nobody would understand why are we doing it. Both conditions were created because of the Hamas savage attack on Israel on October 7th.
Hamas actually has their own version of that. He didn't call it that, but he said they knew when they did that attack on October 7th that Israel would overreact and slaughter all these people. And I'm like, well, why would Hamas do that? And they said, well, so it seems like both sides are willing to have their own people be massacred in order to get a political goal, right? That's what it looks like to me. What, do you have any comment on that?
I totally agree with you. Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And look, so one of the non-binary choices, it should not be a binary choice, right? Is either you're with Israel or you're with Hamas. No, that cannot be the only choices here. Hamas is not a kind or good leader to its people, right? They do sacrifice their people. They do use them as human shields. But let's also be honest that Hamas came to power in a secular Palestine. Right? They were not invited by the people to take over. They essentially destroyed the lives of a lot of people, murdered a lot of secular Palestinians in their seizing of power, but they did it with Israeli funding. They did it with Israel's funding, and Israel made sure they had that power. They wanted this, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. All of this information has been reported in isolation and without context. That is until now. But it in no way excuses the violent and brutal Hamas attacks of October 7th, in which so many lives were lost. But it does raise an important question, a question that brave people have to consider. Did the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence community, and the political leadership of Israel allow this ghastly attack to happen to justify wiping out the population of Gaza?